this class. You know, there was a guitar player and a singer and a keyboard player and a band and everything. So they came to class and they had a keyboard and an oscilloscope on their desk.
Okay.
So we say, okay, hit A, 440 hertz, look at the oscilloscope, and we describe what they're looking at. What is this waveform? What's the wavelength? How does that relate to frequency? We describe if that would move a speaker with that frequency and push air to your ear and make your eardrum vibrate and your brain would process it. Then we put complex waveforms in and said, look, these are harmonics. They're multiple frequencies at the same time, and look at what it sounds like. So we did that for a day or so. Then we brought in laptop computers and gave teams of 3 or 4 a computer, and we gave them tools like a hammer, a pair of pliers, a screwdriver, and said tear those computers apart. So, and we're going to study what's inside. So they looked at it, it's kind of funny, but then they tore it apart. They found the processor and the power supply and the disk drive and looked at the display and all that. Then we showed them how to solder and told them to solder a wire from any point to any other point. We didn't care.
Yeah.
So they learned how to solder. And then we gave them a theremin kit.
Okay.
Or is it a synthesizer kit? I can't remember now.
Yeah.
Synthesizer kit. And they soldered it together and then debugged it and got to take it home.
Okay, cool.
So they were so proud of that. Here are these music students that built their own synthesizer.
You take a handful of 555 chips and just go nuts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. Oh, so we need to go back in?
Well, either that or I suggested maybe you just do the raffle right here.
Okay.
So that way you can just do the two.
Okay. So this is the data point section. And, well, actually, we kind of start over here. We talk about early computing first. We show them an 1800s slide rule. This is called a circular slide rule. This is a classroom slide rule. And of course, with slide rules, you're using logarithms to do math. So that was kind of the first assistance to doing math by hand, right? These are analog computers. They're basically electronic slide rules. They also use logarithms to do calculations. You patch together your problem, the particular problem you're doing, and then you adjust these voltage levels for your input parameters, and you read the result out on a voltmeter in an analog computer. This is a relay computer. So telephone systems, let's see, telephone systems were built with relays, so they were very common, fairly inexpensive, and some of the early attempts at computers were built with relays. A fellow in Austin spent 1.5 years of his life designing and building this relay computer for us. And it's very much like a small microprocessor. And he put LEDs on here so we could see the instruction counter and so forth. And you can hear it executing. So this thing's running about 1/3 of a second per instruction, I think it is. Here's the instruction, you can see it. It's doing an instruction increment every few seconds, sometimes 10 seconds for one instruction. This is the math unit, the ALU. This is the various registers. But you can single step it. And you can see the computer, the change in all the registers in the computer clock by clock, and study how it operates. So it's running the program and it prints over here. Every once in a while you see the printer print one character. That's how long it takes to print one character. hello world. These are early components out of computers. This is a UNIVAC 1 tube array. UNIVAC 1 would fill up the room just about with vacuum tubes. 1 bit, one flip-flop to store 1 bit. There's 2 vacuum tubes. The small one and the big one for 1 bit register. So you can imagine if you had a 16-bit register, then you've got a bank of vacuum tubes this long. Memory was difficult. Early memory, people struggled with memory. So some of the earliest memory was a mercury delay line. You have a tube of mercury, a speaker on one end, and a microphone on the other, and you put a bit in with the speaker. It would propagate through the mercury over time, and the microphone would pick it up, amplify it, and put it back in again. So your data was going around and around in this tube of mercury. You ready?
We are ready.
Okay, we got a break for the raffle. We can have everybody's attention. It's time for the raffle.
Everybody have their tickets? Okay, you're looking. Anybody want to buy any last minute tickets? Okay.
That's a very significant machine. Again, it's thank you so much.
$25 gift card.
$25 gift card.
Austin?
We lost Austin.
Where's Austin?
Austin's gone, he left.
Oh, he left.
Yeah.
Okay, pulled up.
Uh-huh.
Am I calling or you calling?
You're calling.
Last 3?
Yep.
9. 9.
999?
Yeah, took 9.
D.
All right, Dee, you want a $25 gift card, or do you want to go in and draw for the
Oh, what's the deal, D?
All right.
Go for the no one, D. Yep.
Big round of applause for Miss Dee.
Oh.
All right, $50 gift card.
I got 4 of them. 9. 7. 8.
9, 7, 8.
Must be present to win. Hey.
You want the $50 gift card or prize for the TV? Chance on the TV. All right, big round of applause. Here we go.
9. 9. 6.
That's me.
D again.
Greg.
I'll try this. You want to drink that? Sure. Pardon me?
Just me and you go buy a lottery ticket, right?
What?
9. 6. 6.
966.
All right.
Geez, Tim, there you go.
Thank you. Okay, the data point tour.
The data point tour.
The story continues. So prior to data point, computers were big rooms with computers, and the input and the programming is done with punch cards on machines like this. Then those computers were adapted to time sharing. And timeshare machines use these teletypes as the input and output device. We talked about that earlier. So the first product was the data point 3300. We talked about it in the other room. 100 times better than the ASR 33 teletype over there. What the two technologies that made this possible were solid-state memory from Intel, because otherwise we'd have to have a big box of core memory that would cost 10 times more than the terminal cost for the core memory. The other technology was figuring out how to get 72 characters on a TV set, because television sets of that era only had enough resolution to get about 40 characters, and even that didn't look that great. So Jack Alexander came up with a new scanning technology called diddle scanning that was capable of getting 72 characters across the screen. So online by 69. This is a 1969 product. This replaced the paper. This machine over here that had a cassette in it, and it replaced the paper tape recorder in the teletype machine. And if you wanted to print, it printed on this NCR thermal printer, which is as well. So,
Do you know why 72 characters?
well, I don't, other than that machine had 72 characters. I don't know the reason for 72. When the 2200 was developed, it went to 80 characters. So it had 12 lines of 80 characters, or 960 characters on the screen. This had 24 lines of 72 characters. And of course, to put it on the telephone line, this used an acoustic coupler. There were other modems that went in a comm box that you could use also later. The teletype had a modem in the back of it. So the 3300 was very successful. So Computer Terminal started selling them to other OEMs that had timeshare machines. So Hewlett-Packard had a timeshare, they wanted theirs painted gray. Honeywell had timeshare, they wanted theirs painted blue. Digital Equipment had a timeshare, and I can't find a Digital Equipment terminal that was made by Computer Terminal. I've been looking for a while. But anyway, the inspiration for the 2200 came from the fact that these OEMs wanted to have the cursor operate differently from one OEM to another. And it was a big deal because they had to relay out those cards. Was it Gordon you were talking about, or Austin maybe, about the breadboard 3300? Must have been Austin.
Austin.
Spread out on the lab bench. So they had to change those circuits and relay out the boards, and it was expensive and time consuming. So they said, let's put a processor inside so we can just program it to be the terminal we want. So, online by 69, 1970, they had a programmable terminal. So the 2200 came to be to solve a couple of problems. One of them was the programming for different OEMs. Another was they wanted to make it less intimidating so it could go on the desk, for example, of a secretary. So the industrial designer decided that it couldn't be a bigger footprint than an IBM Selectric typewriter. So this was the inspiration for the 2200. It was going to be a personal computer, not a computer room computer. So the CRT is a special design to make the height of the terminal less. That was a custom-built bulb for the CRT to get the size down. It also is 80 characters because that's the same number of characters on a punch card. So you could use key to tape rather than punching it out. You could type it in here and see it on the screen. The first version, these are the hand-built prototypes that were used to raise money to put this in production in the 70s. These were finished in 1970 and taken to an investment banker convention. The first machine had 4 kilobytes of main memory. The keyboard used a diode array encoder. The cassettes we talked about earlier, those are the Philips cassette decks that were modified by adding the solenoids to be able to control them or start and stop. The problem with this early machine was twofold. One was it had so much electronics stuffed in the box, it got really hot. It had loud fans that turned at a high speed to move the heat outside of the box. So it was pretty annoying because it was loud. The other problem was reliability. This was the first machine that used a switching power supply running directly off the AC line in a computer product that was non-spaceborne. So we had NASA engineers designing this thing, so they knew about switching supplies and what could be done, but it had not been put in a commercial product until data point came along. But spacecraft supplies were running on like 48 volts DC. This thing had to run on 110 or 240 AC for Europe, and it was really hard to get a reliable switching regulator. But anyway, it became apparent that if they had the processor board on a chip, it would take up less space and less power, and it'd make the machine more reliable, and they could use the space to add more memory. So this architecture was taken to Intel, the schematics, the instruction set, and they asked Intel to put it on a chip, and Intel refused. So they went to Texas Instruments. Most of the rest of these parts were made by Texas Instruments, the TTL parts, and asked them to do it. And they looked at it and said, "Oh my God, that kind of a processor, that'd be 3,000 transistors. You know, our iPhone has 3 billion transistors in it now, right? 3 billion transistors in this." But anyhow, TI said, "No, 3,000. That's pushing the limit. We really don't want to do that. It's not a memory either. It's not X and Y. It's random transistors." So they turned the project down. So as I mentioned, Phil Ray went to see Bob Noyce at Intel. "Bob, we're your biggest customer. We got to have this on a chip, or we're going to have TI do it." And Intel took the contract in, and we had the purchase order that shows the order of these custom chips for data point. So TI heard about it, and they came back and said, "Wait a minute, we think we can do that after all. So can we do it for you?" Data point said, "Well, we already have an agreement with Intel." But anyhow, they ended up giving the contract to both companies, and it became a race to see who could deliver it first and who would get production quantities, because Data Point really, or Computer Terminal, really wanted that chip fast. So TI delivered the first chip, and it was called the 1735, I think, or 95?
I don't remember.
I can't remember, there was something like that. And that's where I came in. I was this intern kid that didn't have any particular assignment, so this chip came rolling in at a random time, and I got to work on testing the TI chips. And it was actually a processor and a memory chip combination. They were both new chips. And TI had been making bipolar circuits like that TTL. This was their first stab at making MOS products. And they didn't know how to make a MOS memory yet. So the processor seemed to work, but we couldn't load a program in it and execute the program because the memory couldn't hold data long enough, perfectly, so you could have an executable program. It would degrade, there'd be errors in the memory, you'd try to run it, it would go and never land. So and also the TI chip was drawing a lot of power. It was a lot bigger than the Intel geometry was. So that thing was running smoking hot, and it just wasn't reliable. So we sent it back. And then Harry Pyle, Gary, and I designed the version 2 2200 processor using the new 1 kilobit RAM chips. The original machine, this is an early prototype. It used 256-bit RAM chips, I think from electronic arrays. The production machine had twice as much memory. It was 8K bytes.
Those are shift registers, though.
Yeah, 512-bit Intel shift register. This was shift register 2. So when we got the 1K RAM, it was like 100 times faster than the original shift register processor because it was a parallel architecture instead of a serial, and we could randomly access memory and do fetches. So anyhow, once that new processor was available, data share was rewritten to become a timeshare language. And 8 of the dumb tubes were put around one processor, and then you could run 8 programs on one processor. Why is that important? Because this machine was cost about $14,000. The terminals were, I don't know, 3,000?
2 or 3,000.
2 or 3,000. So your cost per seat using that timeshare data share system was way, way lower than using 8 or 16, $14,000 computers. So that exploded Data Point. The timeshare data share product was super successful, and they built the first round of the business on that.
You skipped over the part where you said TIs went in the toilet, and then, so now you're waiting for Intel.
We're still waiting for Intel. so in the time between the TI chip and the Intel chip, we did the second generation our own. Which was faster than the chip, way faster than Intel's chip when they delivered it later. So Data Point was, exponentially growing using the TTL processor. Intel delivered. It wouldn't run timeshare data bus fast enough, so you couldn't use it. And that's when I started working on a laptop computer, and I wanted to use the chip to build a laptop. But there were no displays for laptop computers. The only displays were CRTs back in those days. LCDs were just little things on your watch. They weren't, LCD computer displays. So I wanted to find a display technology and use the Intel chip to make a laptop computer. So I started scouring the world and, visited the watchmakers and I found a company in Minneapolis that was experimenting with gas plasma displays, and they were working on an 80-character single line display, and I was talking to them about building an 80-character, 8-line display. That's as big as they thought they could do it. And then I also talked to the liquid crystal companies, and I drew the schematics of how to build a multiplex liquid crystal display to build this laptop. But meanwhile, Mike Faraday, anybody remember Mike?
Yes.
Our controller?
Yes.
Mike said, I don't want to pay this Intel bill $100,000 or whatever it was.
He didn't have any money anyway.
He didn't have any money, I guess, right. So Vic and I flew out to look at this display technology, and they said, well, it's going to take us another 6 or 9 months to do that. And Mike said, nope, I'm selling the processor. So he did a deal with Intel to give Intel the rights to the processor in exchange for not paying that, was it a $100,000 bill?
So,
Yeah, not paying that $100,000 bill over my cries. I thought it was a mistake. But anyhow, that was the...
And that's the birth of the Intel chip that everything in the world uses.
Correct. That's correct. So it originally was called the 1201. 12 meant a custom design by Intel. 01 meant the first one ever done. First custom design Intel ever did. When Intel took over the rights, they renamed it the 8008 and sold it in their catalog as the 8008. Harry and I went out to Intel after we got the version 2 processor running and talked to Ted Hoff and Stan Mazer, the guys that were working on the processor chip. And we showed them all the enhancements we made and tried to convince them to use our version 2 instruction set because it had more instructions to run the timeshare mode. Try to get them to put it in their next generation chip because we knew they were working on the next chip. So the 8080, which came after the 8008, has some of those instructions. But when they were trying to make it the same, but when they were doing the layout, they ran out of space. So they started juggling instructions around to make it all fit. And it ended up being not compatible with our version 2 processor. So the 8080 came out and we couldn't use it at data point without redoing our assemblers or something. So it was a long time before data point started using microprocessors. Now, at some point, it was after R&D moved to 8400, so I don't remember what date that was, but at some point Zilog came out with a processor, and there was something about its architecture that was intriguing, and I figured out how to take the Z80 and a ROM and hook it together such that the ROM was analyzing the instructions before it executed, and I made it compatible with the data point version 2 instruction set. And that was going to allow us to drop the price of the processor from 14,000 plus or minus down to 3,000 or 4,000. So I had this all figured out and breadboarded it. And we had a meeting with Ed Gustaro, and I was all excited about it because I said, look at this, we'll drop the price and we can sell it to a much broader range of users because it's more affordable. And he looked at that and said, why in the blankety blank would we do that? I can sell all the $14,000 processors that DataPoint can build. You're going to kill our company by reducing the price of each computer. This project is killed. So that was the end of that attempt to use a microprocessor. So eventually DataPoint did start using microprocessors, but it was years and years later. I think it was after I left the company.
It was the 1500.
I thought what's the 1500 based on? I thought
Z80.
It was a Z80? Okay.
Yeah.
So, but we must have reassembled or recompiled for that.
It was
right?
it was a different coding of the system.
Yeah. So it was not instruction set compatible.
It was pretty much user compatible, but it was a different assembler language.
So that's why someone was talking about CPM on a 1500 then.
Yeah, that was Cliff.
Well, there was a 1500 version of DOS because John Cole did that.
Right. Interesting. Okay, well, that's what I know. Of course, this went on to become an 1100, which was a 2200 that did away with the cassette decks and had a ROM boot instead of a cassette deck boot. And I guess it could run on ARC too, couldn't it?
No, 1100 could not.
1100.
1150 and 1170
So it was
could.
only used on diskettes, I guess.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. And then 5500, 6600.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the end of this packaging.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. So another interesting story, and this is a Gus Roche story. Gus was always interested in the electronic office and word processing, and he had made contact with, I think it was a company called Safeguard. They had an accounting ledger that used pens and paper with holes punched in it, and you'd move the paper down on these pens and do accounting. And he sold 2200s to that company. But they also wanted to do word processing. So Xerox had a division called Diablo that made our disk drives, and they came out with this daisy wheel printer. And I had serial number 3 Xerox daisy wheel printer, interfaced it to the computer, and then they wrote word processing to run on that daisy wheel printer. So this was the first generation word processor system. using a daisy wheel. Before that, there was word processing running on an IBM Selectric that Stan Klein rigged up with solenoids to make it print. But there was only one of those. It was one of a kind. But this was mass produced.
This is the setup that I used. Ultimately, I think it was anyway, where you had in the back deck you had scribe.exe back here,
Right.
and then here you put a blank tape, and I did an editor,
Right.
made the letter was the editor, and then used scribe as the interpreter,
Right.
and then printed it on the daisy wheel printer.
Right.
And
Exactly.
then ultimately I got the disk drive, and they had describe, and then later on they came out with iOS, but I was gone by then. So
That's awesome.
as far as word processing is concerned, but yeah.
Who wrote the first editor? Was that Lee Greenspan?
Lee Greenspan.
Yeah.
Well, she wrote the original cassette scribe,
Right.
I think.
Right.
And I think she may have, either she or Harry Pyle or Larry Jensen.
I thought it was Harry Powell wrote scribe. It was Lee Greenspan.
I don't remember who did what, because that happened before I got there.
I think Harry wrote the text editor.
Yeah.
He wrote the operating system,
The general
assembler, and the G-edit.
G-Edit and CTOS and DOS.
Right.
DOS through 1.2.
Right. But I think it was Lee and there was a Cheryl. What was her last name? Cheryl may have worked on that too. Tall, thin lady, real quiet lady. But and then Gene Hughes wrote the next version of the editor. It's funny, Gene is another brilliant programmer like Gordon.
Gene Latham?
Gene Hughes.
Gene Hughes.
Yes.
He was great with algorithms. He wrote the AIM algorithms.